I'm Bob Surridge, I'm the Vice President of Southport Historical Society, and I introduce Liz Fuller, who's the President of the Historical Society. Introduce our speaker. His topic today is At the Mercy of the Angel of Death. Lovely topic.
We all are, aren't we?
And we are. Shannon Walker is going to speaker. She grew up in southeastern North Carolina and has family roots back to the 1720s in the lower Cape Fear. Undergraduate, graduate of Meredith College, a double major in history and studio art. Good combination. And attended grad school at UNCW. She's worked for the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources full-time since January 2010 as a historic interpreter and assistant manager at the Brunswick Town Fort Anderson historic site. She now is the Curator of Programming Education at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Southport. So let me introduce, let's seat these ladies and ask Shannon to start. There's a couple back there, a couple here.
Sorry, traffic. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Bob. As Bob said, my name is Shannon Walker, and I currently work at the North Carolina Maritime Museum here in Southport. Been in Brunswick Town since 2010. And so it was a bit of a change to switch from one to the other, but I do have roots here in southeastern North Carolina, family dating back all the way to 1726 when they came up from the Charleston area and came into Brunswick, Brunswick itself, then went up into Bladen County and stayed in the swamps. So I am very familiar with the swamps of North Carolina. And a little bit more background on me. As he said, I have a background in history and studio art, but I did not start out going to college for that. I was a pre-med major, and I wanted to get into that because when I was 12 years old, I had surgery for scoliosis, and I wanted to become an orthopedic surgeon. So I was going on this route, and I was doing well and really motivated. And then my sophomore year, I was diagnosed with a tremor. And my doctor said, more than likely, you're going to have to find something else to do because there's no way you can operate on people like this. And it's just going to get worse as you get older. So I was disappointed, but then I decided, well, let's try going a route with some other things that I love. And I was looking at communications and a few other things, and I was going to go art anyway. That was my other major, but just as a throwaway major. But then I picked up something from the history department at Meredith by accident, and I started on the public history route. So a way of teaching history without being in the classroom. And so that's how I got on this route. I still thoroughly enjoy biological and natural history and medicine. It's one of my specialties, and so that's why I pursue this route. Sometimes, like if you would go up to Brunswick Town, I would have been dressed out in 18th century clothing and talking about medicine. Do a lot of work with 4th and 8th graders because in North Carolina, that's usually where they focus their North Carolina history on those ages. Sometimes 5th grade because they're doing U.S. history. So I was discussing medicine and disease and things like that. So forgive me if I speak to you like I'm speaking to some 8th graders because that is what I'm used to speaking to. Now, my subtitle here, I forgot to change that, but it's actually supposed to be the yellow fever in the lower Cape Fear. But we are going to focus heavily on the 1862 epidemic in Wilmington because it was not just Wilmington. It branched out because the disease, even though it got there, the people fled and they took it with them. Oh, there we go. All right, so Wilmington and the Lower Cape Fear. I'm going to set the stage. In 1862, Wilmington is your largest city in North Carolina, and part of that hinges on the fact that it is the port of entry, I was about to say for the colony, I've been in the 18th century too long, port of entry for the state. And so I'm going to give you a few numbers here. The 1860 census says there's 5,209 white residents and 4,350 blacks. And 13% of those African Americans are freedmen. Now, an accurate estimate, because you have soldiers that are here at the time, you have other itinerant populations like sailors, that would probably bring your population to well over 11,500 in July of 1862. So you had a substantial amount of people who were living here. This was the most popular port at this time for Confederate blockade runners. Now, in April of 1862, the port of New Orleans fell under Union control. So really your biggest port and the easiest way for you to get goods to supply the Confederacy is to come up into Wilmington. Wilmington is also home to the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad. So you have this railroad that starts in Wilmington. It was originally supposed to go up to Raleigh, but then they switched it and they're heading towards Weldon, which is in Halifax County in the northern part of the state. This is a major lifeline for the Confederacy. So you have all these blockade runners that are running the blockade, they're going around it, and they're bringing in all sorts of goods. A lot of them, they're either coming from Nassau in the Bahamas or Bermuda. And so they're bringing English goods, they're bringing food, they're bringing medicines, they're bringing all sorts of things that are helping to keep the Confederacy running. So we're talking about the Port of Wilmington. Of course, you have to go by Smithville to get up to it. You have your river pilots who are stationed here. You have a number of other individuals who are on the blockade or running the blockade who are living here as well. So this is not, when I'm referring to Wilmington or the Port of Wilmington, it's not just Wilmington, it's Smithville too. It's anyone down here in the lower Cape Fear that's below Wilmington. Now Wilmington itself, if you go into downtown Wilmington today, you have Front Street, which is fairly high up, and then it drops down. And you have Water Street, which runs directly parallel to the river. Keep that sort of visual in mind, because in the 1860s, that area down at Water Street is still flooding when it rains a lot, and you have the king tides and everything. There's also some very marshy areas down there, and you have some naturally occurring ponds. These areas they're kind of gross, and you have lots of mosquitoes and other bugs and things like that living in that area. Yellow fever today, we know that it is transmitted by mosquitoes. It is a virus, just like COVID. It's called a flavivirus. So COVID is a coronavirus. Yellow fever is a flavivirus. It's the same sort of group as West Nile, dengue, and Japanese encephalitis. It cannot live outside the body for more than a few hours. So you can't, if you have COVID, I'm going to get the two confused now. If you have yellow fever, you cannot cough, on someone and spread it that way. It just does not transmit that way. It has to spread in another way. Unlike COVID, it does not mutate easily. So it pretty much has stayed the same since it originally developed. It developed in Africa about 1000 BC, transmitted more than likely from some sort of primate. A mosquito bit that primate and then bit a human being. And that's how it would spread. The disease itself, I'm going to have to look at this right quick to give you a bit more specific information. It was first seen in the Americas in 1648, actually in the Yucatan Peninsula. So more than, Spanish who were colonizing the Yucatan brought it over. And that was one of the first outbreaks. All during the colonial period, anywhere where you had a certain type of mosquito living, and I'll get to that in just a minute, that's where that virus would spread. A little bit more about the disease itself. It has an incubation period of about 3 to 6 days. So once you contract this disease, you're going to be fine for a few days. And then, just like the flu or COVID, you'll get the sudden onset of fever, chills, severe headache. Now, what if two things might happen? you either start to get better or, of course, you start to get worse. And what it does is it causes hemorrhaging in the body. So you start to bleed internally, and then that leads to what they thought of as the telltale sign of death, whereas you start vomiting up black vomit, which is blood that is bled into your system. The telltale sign of that was the yellow skin and jaundiced appearance, and there is no cure for yellow fever still today. So it was believed at the time that there were possibly 2 causes for you to get yellow fever. That it was fumes from rotting vegetable and animal matter that was coming up out of the swamps. So that stinky, marshy smell, that was referred to as a miasma, and that was what was going to make you sick. Or that yellow fever was spread by contact with contaminated goods. So if someone had yellow fever, their clothes that they had on, their blankets was contaminated, and if you came into contact with that, you would get sick from that. And so they thought there were 2 methods of spread for that. Obviously today we know that it comes from something else, the Aedes aegypti mosquito. This is a native species to North Carolina. It's really native to a lot of places around the equatorial belt and subtropical areas. It is most active during the day. And more than likely, if you have been anywhere where there are mosquitoes right now, you have encountered this little guy. They don't live very long. They only live about 2 to 3 weeks, and they produce a lot of eggs. So each female, depending on how much blood they draw up, can produce 100 to 200 eggs to each cycle. And during their lifetime, their 2 to 3 weeks, they produce about 5 egg batches. So that's a lot of mosquitoes. The funny thing about these guys is that mosquitoes, they lay their eggs in water, but with these eggs, they can completely dry up the water source, and they will stay viable for 9 months. So if you have somebody in a junkyard, they have a bunch of tires sitting out, and there's water on them, and the mosquito lays her eggs, and somebody flips that tire over, and the eggs are still there, all dries out, and they continue to leave it there, 9 months later, if water goes back in that, you're going to have some baby mosquitoes. Now, that's not the case for the Anopheles mosquito and the Culex mosquito, which are 2 other native mosquitoes that we have. Their eggs don't stay viable for that long, but these guys do. And another important thing to remember about them is they only have a range of about 1/4 mile. So they do not move very far from where they were hatched. And this is why, when you think about yellow fever and how it spreads, it's spreading by people, not by the mosquito. Even though the mosquito is the vector to bite the person and then bite another person, if that mosquito bites somebody with yellow fever and then goes to another person and bites them, if this person moves 30 miles down the road, they took yellow fever with them, and then a mosquito over there can pick it up and bite somebody else. The mosquitoes are not moving unless, like me the other day, I was at my grandmother's house in Bladen County, and about 15 Aedes aegypti mosquitoes got in the car with me. And then when I got here to Southport, I let them out, and they had traveled, which is unlike what they did in the 1860s. They did not do that. Okay, if you had yellow fever at this time in the 1860s, there was a few different treatments they could try on you. First, they might try to clear the air or the contaminated items that you have by burning turpentine or sulfur to kill these nasty things that they thought were in the air. Now, if you start to show signs of yellow fever, they're going to try purgative and blistering agents and things to make you sweat in order to purge the body of this disease. Now, someone who is running a fever, who has all these flu-like symptoms, one of the last things they want to have is someone come after them with a calomel laxative. But that was what they thought was going to flush out the system. Another thing they might use to treat it is quinine. Now, quinine, they would use it to treat yellow fever, but it's not going to address the disease at all. If they were treating malarial fever, it would, because malaria is a parasite that is also spread by a mosquito, a different kind of mosquito, and quinine actually kills that parasite. But in this case, with yellow fever, it does not, because it's a virus. So that was, even though they had good ideas about it, it did not work. Next up, and these are really the two most important for treating this at the time, or at least the things that work the best. Opiates for delirium and pain. They did have laudanum. They did have morphine at the time. And do you folks know the difference between the two? Okay. So laudanum is what I like to refer as whole opium product. So you have your sap from the opium poppy. You mix it with alcohol, sometimes things like cinnamon and a few other substances to make it a little bit more palatable. And it's the whole substance. So it has not just the pain-killing component of the opium, but also some of the other things to help with anxiety and stuff like that. Morphine, which was first extracted from opium in the early 1800s, is just the pain-killing component of the opium. So it's much more concentrated. Usually when they would administer that at this time, it was in a powder form that they might reconstitute with water and inject it. Or if you had like a surface, like a cut or something on your surface, they might put it directly in that. But both of them are easily accessible and available. You could just go to your pharmacy and pick up, particularly anything with laudanum in it, to take to help calm down your system, to deal with pain. Laudanum was also used to treat a lot of stomach ailments in the 18th and 19th century, particularly things like dysentery, because it slows down the digestive tract. So in this case, they would also use that to treat some of the vomiting associated with that. And then rest and skilled nursing, and that was really all that you could do for yellow fever. With yellow fever, because it's a virus, your body does create some immunity to it if you get it. So if you get this, more than likely, like with chickenpox, you're going to stay immune to it for the rest of your life if you survive it. If you are a small child and you get yellow fever, you have a higher chance of surviving it. Whereas if you're older, and you don't have to be much older, you have more of a risk of dying from it. In some cases, I've seen statistics as far as a 50% chance of not making it if you get yellow fever. It became, even though it was not as deadly as a lot of diseases like smallpox or cholera, it became the most feared disease because of how violent it was and how, if you got it, how high of a risk you might have of dying from it. Keep in mind that it didn't really infiltrate the interior of the country or the states as well as it did on the ports, because it's coming from other areas and being shipped in by people rather than, we don't have the capability like we have today to travel as easily as we did then. All right, so let's go back to the blockade. The Union blockade established in April of 1861, and it is this effort to choke the Confederacy by cutting off trade. So you basically have your Union ships out in the ocean, trying to block your rivers, blocking your ports. Their thoughts are, if you close down all of these ports, you cut off the supply, you will slowly kill the Confederacy. Because of this, blockade running became a lucrative business. And so people are making lots and lots of money. Like that Thompson House right down the road, that was built off of the blockade. I have seen advertisements of things that were dirt cheap prior to the war going up sky high in price, like quinine, for instance. I've seen it selling for like $600 for just a few ounces of quinine, which was outrageous at the time. So they were making big money in this. And they were also bringing in diseases. So there's a few more examples here of the Atlantic blockade. And as you'll see, I'm sure you've seen a map like that before, of the lower Cape Fear. You have your multiple entrances to get into the Cape Fear at the time. You had Old Inlet, it's down that way, and New Inlet, which is up that way. And today, New Inlet, of course, has been closed by the rocks that are there. But those are your routes that your blockade runners would take to get into the river. Sometimes they would even beach themselves up on the other side of Federal Point and cross over that way. All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to go way down into the deep south to New Orleans. Now, in 1862, This was the Confederacy's most important and heaviest populated port city. It fell back under Union control in April of that year. New Orleans had the distinction of having a yellow fever epidemic every single year. I won't call it an epidemic, I call it an outbreak every single year. And they refer to it as the stranger's disease. So if you were not a New Orleans by birth, and you came into the going in the late summer, more than likely this was going to hit you. This is a busy port city. It happens every year. They felt like it's going to knock people out. So when it fell under Union control, you had children in the streets when they would encounter a Union soldier, they would start chanting these like really bad nursery rhymes about how that the stranger's disease was going to kill them. And because this happened every single year. In fact, I'm going to say since 1817 actually. Oh yeah, I've got another stat here. Since 1817, it had killed over 40,000 people who came into New Orleans. So we're in 1862. Now, the fellow in charge of New Orleans at the time was Benjamin Butler, and he will come into play much later on if you discuss the Battle of the Fort Fisher. But he decided to do a big cleanup of the town. He felt, well, maybe if we get rid of some of these miasmatic vapors that are out here, maybe we can control this disease. So they started draining swampy areas to get rid of this foul-smelling liquid that was in those areas. They did a big cleanup. And for the first time in 45 years, there was no yellow fever outbreak in the city. He also established a quarantine. So if you had vessels come in and anybody on board was sick, they would have to stay out in the bay until no one on board was sick anymore. Usually about a 40-day, but sometimes they were extended a little bit longer. But this was an astronomical thing because, again, it had hit that city every single year since 1817. So he did something right. In their case, they thought they were getting rid of the bad vapors, but also the contaminated products that were coming in. But really, they got rid of the mosquitoes. And that's why it did not occur. So now we'll go back to us in the Lower Cape Theater. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard the story about the Kate before. The Kate was a blockade runner. And she would go back and forth between here and Nassau very frequently in 1862. I have here a list of some of the things that were on board the Cape actually in November, because she was banned from coming into Wilmington, so she started going to other places. But she has things on board like calomel, potassium, sulfur, morphine, soaps, wax, fine combs, ivory. So all sorts of fancy things on board this vessel. In this case, in August of 1862, she had a number of things. One of them was bacon, which kind of confuses me because we're in North Carolina. Why are you importing bacon? It's already here. So she, when she left Nassau, there was another epidemic happening there. Like August, September, October, it's not only hurricane season, it's prime yellow fever epidemic season. And so when she left, as she was coming back, there were sailors on board who were sick. So she comes into port in Wilmington. There is no quarantine at this time. There's no quarantine officers or anything like that. So she just comes right on up. And a number of the crew were sick. And one of them, named Dennis Mitchell, died on August the 17th while the ship was in dry dock for repairs. While they were there in Wilmington, you had merchants going on board the vessel, and they would look at some of the products that they had, want to know if they bring it into their store. One of these merchants was named Louis Schwartzman, and he was one of the first documented cases of a citizen getting this. Now, keep in mind, these ships go up to Wilmington. And remember what I talked about with Water Street being so low and you're having all this, water essentially there. And the river is not salty up there at this time. The salt wedge has not gone that far up. So it's all fresh water. Those mosquitoes have bitten people who have been aboard the Kate. And they're just hanging out in their own little area. And so they start spreading it around. And you can look at some of the maps of the time of Wilmington, and you can kind of pinpoint the houses where the cases started at, and you'll see it's around that area. So rumors were starting to spread that the fever was here in the Lower Cape Fear, and it was raging. And so folks started to panic, and if you could afford it, you were leaving town because you do not want this. I kind of make it the equivalent of Ebola in a way. It's that scary of a disease. So if you could afford it, you're leaving. A number of the richest folks who lived in Wilmington might have had houses and plantations along the river, or a house down here in Smithville. They're getting out of town. It became so panicky that the mayor, John Dawson, Dawson Street in Wilmington is named after, he launched an investigation, and his investigation showed that only 5 people had died from it. It's okay. And so he wrote a number of epistles saying, don't panic, everything's all right. The editors of the paper wrote, like, these are big rumors, it's really not a big deal, everybody just needs to calm down. And all of this is over, we're going to be fine. But they were very much wrong. Now, the physicians that were in Wilmington, I think we had about 10 at the time. Let me see. Yes, 10 physicians who served the public at the outbreak of the epidemic. None of them had ever experienced a yellow fever epidemic before, or really dealt with the disease much. Say the last outbreak we had in the Lower Cape Fear was in 1821. So it's over 40 years earlier. They weren't practicing at the time. As I said, you had physicians who did not know what they were dealing with here. They only read about it in books. You had panicked families that are leaving. The population dropped drastically. Now, those who were still there were those who could not afford it, or those who were, unable to. So I'll use a family, and this, I'm making this up at the moment, but say like the Bellamy family. They're leaving their big house there, and they're heading, I'm not sure where they went. They might have went out towards Pender County. And so they're leaving their enslaved labor there to run the house. You don't want to leave it unguarded. You had troops that were stationed there in Wilmington as well. Their officers are trying to get them out, but where do they want to go? There's only so many places you can send them. You can send them to Fort Anderson, you can send them down to Caswell and Fort Pender, back that way. But you're basically leaving the city unmanned because everyone's trying to flee out that can. So you have a number of folks who are that basically are being requested to come and help. The mayor of Wilmington actually got in touch with folks in Charleston because they had experienced this more recently. And so bringing folks up to help out with that, the Sisters of Mercy, who were Catholic nuns. Dr. William T. Bragg was also very experienced with dealing with yellow fever. The Sanitary Commission, if you do any reading on the Civil War, you'll see where it's basically a civilian group that's working with the government to try to deal with a number of the hygiene and disease issues associated with the war. But they're attempting to clean the air of the miasmatic fumes that they assume are making people sick. Because everything is shutting down at the time. Your paper's shut down, your stores are shutting down. They require that at least one store in town be open so that people can function. So if we go back to 2020 and think about going to the grocery store trying to find toilet paper, it was that times much, much more because nothing was available for them to have access to. They even opened up a soup kitchen, and they were trying to enforce strict quarantine laws. So if you were sick, you were not just getting out and going about and stay in your house. Now, this little article from the state is a bit confusing to me because it was referring to Fort Caswell, but then it also talks about Smithville at the same time. It gets very confusing. But we know that there were at least 30 deaths outside of Wilmington associated with this yellow fever epidemic. And there's actually a few folks, if you go down the street to the cemetery, you'll see them that they passed away from that. We had it pop up here at the fort here. It actually killed a few of the surgeon and the matron, which is a head female nurse. But it was not from mosquitoes that were here. They would have picked up the disease somewhere else and brought it here. There was actually, I think it was Curtis that might have written, yes, it was in his recollections of the war and the time, around that, where they really didn't think it was bad here because of the breezes, and that he sort of felt like Southport was almost immune to it in a way, because it just did not did not happen like it did in Wilmington. And I really personally think that does have to do with the layout of the land, the water, where it's located, some of the salinity as well associated with that, and also the breezes. I personally don't have that much of an issue with mosquitoes because I don't get an allergic reaction when they bite me. I don't know if it's because my people come from the swamps and they became immune to it over time. But honestly, I've not encountered that many mosquitoes when I'm here in the Southport proper area. Whereas if you go 8 miles up the road to like BSL, you're going to encounter them there. So I'm really, something environmental was more than likely keeping that from occurring here. But there were deaths associated with the yellow fever epidemic that were brought in. Some of them amongst families, some of them amongst troops. Okay, so the first killing frost hit Wilmington in the lower Cape Fear about mid-November. That was about a couple of weeks after it usually hits. So they had a warmer summer than normal, warmer fall than normal. And at that time, the Wilmington Journal reported that there were no more deaths associated with the disease because it knocked out the mosquitoes. The journal itself estimated about 1,500 cases, and the death toll was at about 654. Now, I've seen all sorts of different numbers. So we really are unsure of an exact count on that. If they were buried in a private cemetery, they wouldn't have kept track of the numbers. If you go up to Oakdale Cemetery, you'll see the big mound of yellow fever victims, and that's one of the cases where they do have a count on how many people are there. But if they were buried in a private cemetery, we don't know. All right, so even though this whole thing, this war with the disease was going on, we were still in the midst of a civil war. Major General William Henry Chase Whiting came into the lower Cape Fear in mid-1862 to take charge of Wilmington's forces. And he found that everything was in disarray. So a lot of your troops had been evacuated, the whole city had basically been dead for months. And so he basically worked to try to bring it back up to where it could be defended. He was worried that the Federals at any moment might decide to invade and just go ahead and take this port, and everything is over already. At that same time, U.S. Navy Commander William Parker wanted to attack Wilmington. He wanted to take on the port because he knew that this disease had ravaged the city. And so it's like, we can take the lower Cape Fear, we can hit Fort Fisher right now, we can get up and get to Wilmington, it will be no problem. However, his commanding officer, General John Forster, was more interested in leading an expedition against Goldsboro with the objective of destroying the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad from up in that area. And so that was a lost opportunity. At that time, if Union forces had chosen to hit the lower Cape Fear, they more than likely would have taken it. The city's defenses were down. Even though you had troops here and Caswell and at Fort Fisher and Anderson, basically everything had been pretty much shut down for months. And they could have easily taken it, but they chose not to at the time. All right, so speaking of Fort Anderson. So after what happened in 1862, General Whiting established Fort St. Phillips, that would eventually be changed to Fort Anderson, as one of the big quarantine stations for the lower Cape Fear. What would happen is if you were on a blockade runner and you come into the Cape Fear, you had to stop at Fort Anderson and be inspected to make sure there's no one on board who is sick. Your cargo would have to be unloaded. It would be fumigated. And in this case, they would usually burn something like sulfur, and they would fumigate the cargo that way to make sure there's nothing that's contaminated in there, and ventilate it for up to 15 days. You're basically sitting there waiting. Now, if you chose to go on past the fort, they would fire on you. And so we have records of an officer they refer to as Crazy Mac, who would fire on vessels when they did not stop there at the fort. In addition to that, when a ship left Wilmington, they would have to stop there again and be searched to make sure there was no one on board who was sick. And they would also fumigate the vessel again and look for stowaways. Now, the stowaways they were looking for were usually enslaved Africans that were seeking freedom, trying to get to the Union blockade or to get down to Nassau. And so they would flush them out, by burning sulfur in the cargo holds. So that was the role of Fort Anderson at this time. And one of the reasons it was chosen was because it's fairly isolated, just like it is today. It was also, and so there weren't that many people there that could see what was going on and also get exposed to a disease if it was there. If you go up to Brunswick Town, Fort Anderson, and you're on the waterfront, and you look this way towards the north, you'll see there's a natural bay there. And so that's where they would put those ships that were in quarantine and hold them there in that area. Now, there were other smaller quarantine stations along Cape Fear. You had one over at Fort Fisher, for instance, but it was not the big one that you had to stop. And they were more used, I think, as overflow areas at the time. All right, so you would have thought that that we would have learned our lesson as far as yellow fever after 1862 with what happened in Wilmington, but that wasn't the case. We're going to go up north a little bit towards Newburgh. So in 1864, yellow fever struck troops there. I don't know where it came from in this case. I've not been able to find any evidence of how it happened, but it struck Union troops that were there. One doctor who was with the 15th Connecticut, he had already seen the disease in Mexico. He saw it and he diagnosed it in the troops, and then his officers who were over him got very upset about it. Like, you can't go around telling people they have yellow fever. You're going to cause a panic. Well, so they reprimanded him for that. But word got out that this was going on, and suddenly the disease had spread. And it actually spread throughout the city. And so by the first frost, 303 soldiers and 700 civilians had succumbed. And if you look at those numbers compared to the official numbers on the Wilmington count, it's more. So still out, still about, and causing havoc. All right. So now let's leave the Civil War and let's go a bit further in time. I watched a wonderful presentation the other day. It was you, Ms. Pat Kirkman, on Walter G. Curtis and his family. And so that was great. So I recommend checking that out on the Southport Historical Society's YouTube page. But he was appointed the quarantine physician for the Port of Wilmington in the late 1860s. Prior to what happened in 1862, there was no quarantine here in the Lower Cape Fear. Anyone could come and go. I mean, they're going to check your what you have on board and all of that. They're going to keep track of that for customs and things, but they're not going to check you for disease. And so after what happened in 1862, it's like, okay, we got to keep that from happening again. So in 1866, they established a quarantine hospital and a quarantine physician. I've seen this hospital called multiple things. I've seen it called the Deepwater Point Quarantine Station. I've seen it called the Prices Creek Hospital. I just know it's up near Deepwater Point, somewhere in that area, on the land at this time. He would have to check every single ship that came into port, make sure no one was sick. If they were sick, they actually had to be treated by him, and they had to pay a fee for being treated. But he wanted to make sure not just yellow fever was being spread, but also smallpox. And I've seen a number of newspaper articles that have where he was treating smallpox patients because he didn't want that to get further up and them to get amongst everyone and spread it. And here it's very difficult to read, and I can't really zoom in, but he has a list of what quarantine tails for each vessel. And he would put this in the paper like periodically. So he's the quarantine physician of the Port of Wilmington. This is what you have to do if this is going on. Let's see. A few of things he has in here. All persons, whatever belonging to a vessel in quarantine, are strictly prohibited from leaving the vessel except for written permission of the quarantine officer. No boat or craft is permitted to go alongside a vessel at quarantine for any purpose whatsoever, except the master thereof have written permission from the quarantine officer. So it's a list of all the things that you have to follow if you are in quarantine. The hospital that he was in charge of ran into some issues. At one point, it burned by accident. A number of other things happened to it. However, Dr. Curtis felt that it was a very adequate hospital. There was actually one of the premier doctors, and I can't recall his name, it did start with a W, came to visit the Wilmington area and wrote like this scathing review saying that, oh, well, they don't have that great medical facilities here in the Lower Cape Fear. So Dr. Curtis wrote back, oh, yes, we do. And this is what I have, and it's more than adequate, and it's wonderful, and you don't know what you're talking about. It's a really interesting little letter that he wrote. But it ran into some problems. It was burned by accident at one point, and they lost this hospital. And so for a long time, in like the 1880s and the 1890s, you see the state of North Carolina and local representatives pushing to rebuild this hospital because they don't have one. And it wasn't until 1897 that the new hospital was built. And this is the floating hospital that was located off of Deepwater Point in the river. Now, this was designed so that you had areas for folks to stay who are in quarantine. You had hospital areas. They also had machines set up to do the fumigations of the vessels. It, however, was not working, used for very long. It was decommissioned in 1937 and later on was burned in 1951. And today we only have the base left for the water tower out there. So that was their efforts to try to keep yellow fever at bay at the time. As I said earlier, they still did not understand where this came from. They thought it was these miasmatic fumes that were coming off of this bad water, or they thought it was with contaminated material. However, it would not be until 1900 that the Aedes aegypti mosquito was named as the vector for yellow fever transmission. And this was discovered by a series of experiments conducted in Cuba at what was later called Camp Lozère by the United States Army Yellow Fever Commission by Major Walter Reed. And just to give you a quick overview of how these experiments worked is you had these cabins set up, and in one cabin you would have all this contaminated blankets and clothing that had been worn by yellow fever victims. And so you'd have like this vomit covered clothing and dirty blankets. They'd wrap people up in them, and you had to stay in there for so long. And then in another building, they had mosquitoes. And these mosquitoes had bitten people who had yellow fever. And so what they found was the folks who were in the contaminated, even though it was incredibly nasty, contaminated cabin with the blankets and everything, they did not get yellow fever, but those in the cabin with the mosquitoes did. And that's when it was determined that it was the mosquitoes that were spreading this and not contaminated blankets and not bad air or anything like that. You had multiple physicians and also nurses who were working with Walter Reed who actually died from it because they offered themselves as the ones to be experimented on during this. Now today, why you don't hear of yellow fever as often as what you did back so many years ago is that we started working on knocking out the mosquito population to deal with the disease. So there's not been a case of yellow fever in the contiguous United States since 1996. And that was a fellow who had went to Brazil on a fishing trip. He brought it back with him. And I think he survived it. You had mass efforts to reduce the mosquito population, which not only helped out with yellow fever, but also with malaria. You have stories of children running behind the DDT trucks, breathing in those nice fumes. But that is why we do not have the issues with it today that we did then. Now, if someone does have yellow fever, the CDC is going to know of it pretty darn quick because they are going to isolate them. I do know with malaria, there was like right in March of 2020, right as COVID hit, I remember seeing on the news somebody in Charlotte had malaria and they had to isolate, I believe it was this lady inside the hospital to make sure no mosquitoes bit her and spread that. But yellow fever still pops up from time to time, particularly in third world countries, places in Africa. And it is still an incredibly rough disease to deal with. There is a vaccine for it, so you have a number of troops that will take that before they go overseas, or folks, Doctors Without Borders and things like that. But it's not commonly offered up to the general public, just like the smallpox vaccine is not offered up to the general public now. But it is still an incredibly scary disease with no cure. But thank goodness we've not had to deal with it for quite some time, and we've not had an epidemic here since 1862. So does anyone have any questions?
Just a comment, there's still probably 30,000 deaths annually in Africa from yellow fever.
Oh, yes.
30,000, between 20 and 60 annually. And if you travel in some areas, you have to show proof of vaccine, depending on where you're going. Pretty significant.
Yes. And you
Glad
think
you're traveling.
today, with the way we are able to travel, if we did not have vaccines or that knowledge of how it spread, it would be all over. Because if it spread so quickly when we have such limited capabilities of traveling, just think of what it would be like today. Yes.
I was just wondering, I think it was the Sanitary Commission, is that the beginning of the Red Cross?
No, it's a different organization, but at the time, Clara Barton did do some work with the Sanitary Commission, but they basically sort of, over time, they wound up sort of becoming synonymous in a way. The Sanitary Commission just fell out, and the Red Cross sort of taking up the role of that.
And it's one of the reasons that they thought it came from clothing was because of the plague.
I'm honestly unsure. I think it has to do with
Black plague.
if you have folks who are in the same space and they are sharing clothing or they touch someone's clothing or things like that and they get sick, it's from them being exposed to the same mosquitoes, but not so it's just the two sort of coincide so well that you couldn't really distinguish the two. So I think that's where that came from. The same way with the Black Plague, people are co-inhabiting the same space, so there must be this assumption that it's come from that, but not necessarily a bug that's transmitting it or a rat or anything like that. So, but yeah.
We did have some cases here, and as you said, there weren't that many here in Southport because we like to credit it to our salubrious breezes, of course. But in digging up stories under the silent stones out there in the cemetery, that in the Brown plot, which is our center spot with a broad iron around it, there's a daughter of the Brown family who died of yellow fever, and two of her sons. And then just nearby, the grave of a, not a road runner, a blocking runner, Mr. Price, who died down in the Bahamas, that when his belongings came back, packed away in a trunk or whatever, that she and his wife or whatever were unpacking these things, and then next thing you know, they're all dead from yellow fever.
That's right.
So they credited that to his belongings having the fever in them.
And that's what I was wondering about that the other day, because I was like, okay, so he died, in Nassau, and it's like, how did that happen? Like, his immediate family is, getting this, and it was just like.
Well, I don't think it came from that, like
it's
you were saying.
happenstance.
It was still in that time period that it was rampant in Wilmington, and other things came into play. But that was a convenient, or not a convenient, but a well-known reason why people would say, oh, I know they got that from unloading his trunk. They should have never done that, that sort of thing.
It's like when COVID first broke out and people were wiping down their groceries,
Oh,
you
yes.
didn't really know how it was spreading, and it's just that idea, look, it must be this. Households are getting this like this. Yes.
Did Oakdale get established because of all of the deaths?
It had actually been in place before that. Gosh, I don't know, was it the 1850s? But it was outside of town at the time. It wasn't deep inside like it is today. So it would be considered, if you're happy, rural, and it's a better spot to put the bodies rather than, deep inside town like at St. James or anywhere like that. But it had been established just shortly prior to it. And I believe the head of the cemetery at the time, he got it, and he was buried out there as well.
It
Yes.
Is there any information about the Native American population? Yellow fever?
Historically, I've never seen anything. Now, here in the lower Cape Fear, what they refer to as the Cape Fear Indians had pretty much left the area by 1726. And we think that they might have joined up with the Waccamaw Sioux, so over where Columbus County is today. Being that they're that far away from the port itself, I've never seen anything. You do have some Lumbee who are moved out to Fort Fisher when they were constructing that. And I've not seen anything as far as any of them succumbing to it, but then again, that's an area I've not really researched. But historically, I've never seen any sort of anything referring to that. We do know that yellow fever didn't come into the area until you had white folk bring it in here. Because even though it originated in Africa, by this point in the 1700s, it had already spread out into other areas where they were colonizing. So, yeah.
And I just want to say, I think it was in the Maritime Museum that you gave a tour to a class with Rebecca Long from BCC, and you had a very nice, I think it was under glass schematic of the port and the quarantine station. But that was at your museum, right?
Yes, it's over there, and so we're open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 4 at this time. So feel free to go over there and check it out anytime. It's really pretty little, not little, it's actually fairly big model, and so yeah, it's there to look at. And if you go over to Deepwater Point, you can still see where the water tower was, that concrete, it's like 20 by 20, I believe, platform that's out there today.
Thank you very much, Shannon.
You're welcome.